Good afternoon, everyone. We have Brooke Mayer from MRB Group here to present project management. Brooke?
Thanks, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today on what is a snowy day, oddly, in Rochester. I hear it's snowy out your way as well. So really glad to be here with you to talk about one of my favorite topics, project management. So again, I'm Brooke Mayer. I work with MRB Group. We're headquartered in Rochester, New York, but we work across the state and in a number of Southern Tier communities, Southern Tier West communities, and excited to say hello to friends old and new today. So as Sarah mentioned, we're going to be going over project management, which I'm calling endearingly the art and science of efficiently completing projects. So in some ways, and let me back up for a minute, project management is in some ways sort of the hidden component of a project. It's really the time and the effort that you might not anticipate being required in just looking at a project description. So ahead of doing the job, we need to develop an organizational structure for how we do the job to ensure that it's approached in a way that gets us efficiently and effectively to the result that we're setting out to achieve. And so excuse the silly trope here, but bear with me because I think it's a fun way of thinking about project management. You might say it's as easy as baking a cake, in that if you don't use the right ingredients, which are your resources, if you don't measure them out in the right proportions, your resource allocation, and if you don't add them in the right sequence and bake it for the right amount of time, which is your project plan and your project schedule, you really aren't likely to end up with what you were hoping for. And in fact, you might just end up with a flat out bust or a failure, to carry out the cake baking analogy. You might end up with something quite different from what you intended to end up with. So best wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we'll miss you. Clearly there was a break in communication there. Or you might just end up with something that's flat out unrecognizable in this quite valiant but sad attempt at a Buzz Lightyear cake. So that's essentially where the cake baking analogy falls short, because we all know that in reality, project management is harder than baking a cake. And that's because there's no project specific recipe to follow. You know, you have to identify and secure your resources, which may or may not include a hard fought budgeting negotiation or a fundraising effort. You have to allocate them in a logical and efficient manner. And then you have to define your timeline based on a series of parameters that are both known and unknown. You have to work alongside and co-create with a team of other people. You have to employ estimation based on a set of both known and unknown factors. You know, they're not always predefined for you as you're setting out on a project. And then lastly, project management really requires a great degree of flexibility to navigate hiccups and roadblocks and other unforeseen conditions that we're all familiar with running into as we set out on a project. So it was a good analogy to start with, but I'm gonna drop it there. So a quick note on the idea of muddling through. I think we're all familiar with the practice of muddling through, in which we achieve a degree of success or something that looks like or is adjacent to success through iteration, through making the best decisions we can with only partial information, and through just good hard work that we're all familiar with doing. Public sector work often requires some degree of this art and science of muddling through, because there isn't always a playbook with which we can navigate public realm challenges. The present pandemic, the COVID-19 challenge, is an extreme but timely example of this, of having to be nimble and really make snap decisions based on best available data. That said, and I love this little graphic, beginning, muddle, and end, just to demonstrate graphically that, there are always best laid plans, but then, you're going to run into some unforeseen conditions. That said, when you embark on a project, it is invaluable to have a project management framework and at least a plan in place so that you're oriented towards your goal, and so that deviations from your best laid plans and your assumptions are really informed by realistic project parameters. And this foundational project management structure is what we're going to discuss today. And I think that many of you will be more than familiar with a number of the concepts that I'm going to go over, but it's always helpful to take a step back from our day-to-day firefighting and reorient ourselves toward an organized and measured approach. If we had all the time in the world, how would we really go about doing this? And then we shoot to do the very best we can in the time that we have. And project management on a detailed level isn't, a one-size-fits-all practice. You're going to be well aware of that. There will, of course, be variations based on the project, whether it's a capital project, whether it's a study, whether it's a plan, whether there are grant funds involved. But what I've attempted to do in my presentation today is to stay high level enough so that you can adapt this approach to your needs as they arise. And then hopefully we'll be able to drill down into some specificity during our Q&A. And Sarah helpfully reminded me that there is a chat feature and a Q&A feature. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box at any time. If I think it makes sense to touch on the question in the span of the presentation, I'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we can go through them at the end of the presentation. So just a quick note about project roles in the municipal environment, and this certainly extends to the county level as well. I just wanted to, given that the topic of this presentation is project management, not every single person within who's involved is going to be actually doing the project management, but there are a number of different roles that have critical involvement in moving a project along to completion. So just very briefly, when it comes to elected officials, the role is primarily around project approval and funding approval, to hold municipal staff or county staff and contractors accountable to what was approved and to what the community has set out to do. And then to maintain communication channels to ensure that your constituents are kept in the loop on project status, on project updates, on delays, potentially anything that they're going to need to know relevant to the project. When it comes to planning and zoning boards, the role is really about regulatory review and approval. And then when it comes to staff, those are the folks that are really, I'm sure that there are many staff members on the call today that are really responsible for project ownership, for project execution, and for consultant and vendor management to really translate the project from the vision to the product at the end of the day. So as you're setting out on a new project, it's really important to begin with the end. So really, start out with defining what it is you're trying to achieve and then backcast from there. Really, trying to define your why. Projects are undertaken for a reason, to meet a specific need or to address a specific issue. So taking time to define that reason in a detailed way, really capturing what your why for engaging in the project is, can help orient all project actions and efforts towards that goal and keep them oriented toward that goal. And this is really, as you're aware, this is really a prerequisite to get your project off the ground, because you'll need to define this early on to obtain funding, to obtain your project approvals, to procure a contractor or consultant if you're not going to be doing the work in-house. And so that's really your square one. So I thought a useful example for today, given that we probably all have some degree of familiarity with this type of project, might be a streetscape enhancement project. So if I'm defining my why or my goal for streetscape enhancement project, that goal would broadly be improve bike and pedestrian mobility. Then I would move on to defining specific project objectives. And these really define the what of your project. So we're moving from why to what. And these objectives really serve as goalposts to define what project success is and what success looks like. And if you make them SMART, to use an acronym that many of us, I imagine, are familiar with, and that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So really defining your goals along those terms, it will be much easier to recognize where you're deviating from your goals and where your project is getting off course. So to use the streetscape enhancement project example again, an objective might be, by 2022, our community is going to add 25 miles of bike lanes. Or by 2022, we'll add high visibility, distinctive pavement treatments at 50% of the community's highest traffic crosswalks. So that's where you really break it down into more bite-sized pieces that can then be used as a goalpost to guide project actions moving forward. So once you've defined those foundational elements, you're going to move into your project plan. And this is really sort of the meat and potatoes of your project management framework. It's your roadmap for efficient and effective project execution. It requires a lot of work up front. Like I said, it's sort of the hidden work, the work that you have to put in before you're doing the work to execute the project. But the return on the investment is invaluable once you get into project implementation. It makes it move that much smoother. And if you don't set these parameters up front, it's so much harder to discern where your project goes off the rails during implementation. And it's just that much easier to get off track. So this is your roadmap. And the first activity in defining this roadmap is to define your specific tasks, your specific deliverables, and your key milestones for project completion. So that's everything from your funding approvals to procurement to maybe items of interagency coordination to project closeout. In terms of key milestones, it should be inclusive of all of your critical decision points and approvals. So for instance, seeker, your public hearings, enabling work. To use the streetscape example again, maybe there are shallow utilities that you'll need to relocate to facilitate your streetscape improvement work. The utilities relocation work should be included within that project plan. Even if you're not going to be implementing that particular task, it should be part of your project plan so that it remains a known quantity. And then lastly, within this bucket, you really want to think through task interdependencies. So of course, there's going to be a logical sequence along which this list of tasks progresses. For instance, you can't lay your distinctive pavers in your crosswalks before you excavate to relocate the utilities. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. So as you put your project plan together, just do your best to map this sequence out in your plan. Then secondly, defining your communication strategy. So this will entail mapping out your what I call your intra-team check-in schedule. So within your team of staff that is responsible for moving this project along, you want to set up a regular check-in schedule, whether that's just an email check-in, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a virtual meeting. You want to set clear expectations from the outset of the project about when and how project updates are communicated. You can always cancel it if it's not needed, but having that there and having it be a known quantity for your team is extremely helpful in keeping communication channels open within the team. And then, of course, there are always going to be issues that come up outside of those regular check-ins. And so defining your team strategy for conveying information about delays, about setbacks, changes in scope. It could be as simple as, make sure you email me as soon as you know that we're deviating from the plan, but having an understanding of when and how those deviations are communicated is helpful, defining that from the outset. And then critically, mapping out your public-facing strategy is a key step in developing your project plan. And that includes defining the channels through which you want to keep the community informed, and at least as a starting place, the key milestones where you're going to provide updates to the community at large. So maybe it's through your website, maybe it's through your social media accounts, maybe it's in a meeting, maybe you're actually looking for input, but having those milestones mapped out in your project plan is always helpful. And then the sort of last bucket within the project planning phase is to identify the resources required to translate your project into reality. So that's your funding, your available budget, what's it going to cost, what kind of people power and technical expertise are you going to need for this project? Is it something that you can do in-house? Is it something you're going to need to procure consultants for? And then broadly, time based on the scope, how much time is going to be needed to complete the project. And I encourage folks to look at lead times, not only for just like straight up implementation, but also for your project approvals, your public hearings, coordination with other involved agencies. We mentioned the utility issue. To your best knowledge, putting all of those things in your project plan so that they're known quantities to the extent possible. So that's sort of the project plan in a nutshell, to the extent that you can put it into a nutshell. And there are obviously a wealth of amazing collaborative project management tools out there for your use. And they're extremely powerful collaboration tools. You've probably heard of Basecamp, Monday, Airtable, Microsoft Project. Like I said, there's a wealth of tools out there. The list goes on. But it is important to note, and I did just want to take a minute to note it today, that there is time and effort associated with onboarding your team to a new tool. And so I encourage you to adopt them in a considered and thoughtful way. And most critically, it's helpful to remember that project management software and these cool tools out there are great to make projects happen and makes it easier to advance projects, but they don't function on their own or in a vacuum. They work because your team works, that people work, and because there's a team culture that supports it. So just know, as you adopt new project management tools and software, you've got to have buy-in, and you've got to have adoption for it to be worth its while. And at the simplest level, the two key tools that you really need that all of these collaborative project management platforms have are, just a simple spreadsheet-based, time-bound project plan that includes all of those components that we just went over. You often see that in the form of a Gantt chart. And then, of course, your budget, just to keep track of where you are, what your spend rate is. Those are really your critical building blocks to ensure that everyone's on the same page about the project plan. But of course, you can get as creative as you like. Those are just sort of the fundamentals. So now that you've done all this planning, you can move forward with project execution and really put your plan to work. One thing that I've seen happen a number of times over is that despite best intentions, once a project gets underway, that project plan that you put so much work into, that you got buy-in around, can go by the wayside sometimes. Maybe there are emerging issues and parameters have changed, and it doesn't seem relevant anymore. Don't let all your good work go to waste. Project parameters are always going to change over the course of a project. But if you've developed a strong project management framework and you've made your objectives SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, your project management framework is going to be flexible enough to adapt it accordingly. Think of your project plan really as a living tool, and your role as project manager is really to keep it relevant and updated to reflect emerging conditions, because we know those conditions are always going to come to bear. So don't let your good work go by the wayside. Secondly, communicate within your team. Again, new parameters. I'm sounding like a broken record, I realize, but I think we're all familiar with getting a new factors thrown our way as we're advancing a project along. So new parameters, roadblocks, other unforeseen disruptions are inevitable. Public sector work doesn't take place in a vacuum or a lab setting. There's always fun, unforeseen conditions. So just stick to your intra-team communication plan and make sure that your team members are aware of the emerging issues. Communicate early and often, as we like to say. And then thirdly, communicate out. Your community members are your clients effectively. And so we need to communicate project status accordingly. We went over, development of a communication plan, what channels you want to use, what milestones you feel the community needs to be updated at. Those things will all have been sort of fleshed out in your project plan, and during project execution, it's just a matter of committing and sticking to those commitments. And then, we discussed interagency coordination. There are likely a multitude of other departments and agencies involved in your project, depending on the scope of the project. It's important to keep those communication channels intact for efficient and effective coordination, so that those utilities can be relocated within your project timeline. So once you've executed your project, once you reach that finish line, you might be inclined to throw your hands up or take a victory lap, which you definitely deserve in executing your project. But before you do that, I really encourage you to take time to document your job well done, to really, package up your project plan, any key correspondence, your as-built, other key items, so that you can reference them and learn from them in the future. And I also would encourage you to take a minute to summarize the project in whole, just to, very broadly, and I'm talking a couple few neat descriptive sentences, describe the goals, your objectives, and the outcomes of your project, because you never know when that's going to come in handy, whether it's for future grant opportunities, whether for it's a similar scope down the line. I think we can all relate to having a need for these kind of project summaries in our day-to-day work. So never know when that's going to come in handy. And then lastly, really taking the time to debrief. It's so critical. You've put in good, hard work. You've committed to a project plan. You've stuck to your project plan. You've implemented it accordingly. You've been nimble and stayed flexible with emerging factors getting thrown your way. So take a minute to do an after action review with your team. Celebrate your wins, but also consider what might be improved upon for your next time around, because there's always room for improvement, as you're aware. And certainly, you can speak to the success of the project, but I think it's very valuable to speak to the success of your project management framework. How did we move that project along? Even if the project wasn't a success at the end of the day, did we successfully manage the project in an efficient and effective way? So definitely take the time to do that. So with that sort of wraps up this high-level overview of project management in a nutshell. And I just want to say thank you to the Southern Tier West board for having us today. Really appreciate and take pleasure in having an opportunity to speak with you. And with that, I'll open it up to questions, and hopefully we can really drill down into some of your specific projects to crack open what this project management framework means for you.
I don't see any Q&A at the moment.
Is anyone working on a particular project that they run into some roadblocks with, that they want to troubleshoot? No problems, huh? Everyone's projects are proceeding like clockwork. I commend you.
Everybody's quiet today.
Yeah, I think, I wanted to keep this project high level because project management can apply to so many different types of opportunities, and certainly if you're advancing a comprehensive plan versus a capital project, it's going to look a little bit different, but broadly the concepts apply across the board. So I don't know if anyone's working on particular studies or capital projects that they'd love to kind of talk through, I'd love to drill down into some detail with you.
Everybody's still quiet. Okay, we have one. Can you see it?
Suggestions for getting materials from team members. Any tips on frequency of reminders? I'm having trouble getting timesheets for match resources, for instance. Yes. This is sort of an age-old issue that I've run into time and time again. Collating and securing documentation is always a challenge, and it's particularly challenging to, going back to the project plan idea, it's like particularly challenging to estimate how much time that type of activity is going to take, because it's so dependent on, you know, what information is available, how much time your team members have. I would, well, with regard to frequency of reminders, I think, you know, we're all busy. We all have a million things going on. Things inevitably get buried in our inboxes. So I'm always a big fan of the phone call, of text, if you like to communicate that way. I find that email sometimes you can feel overloaded, and reaching out through other channels can be helpful. And then making it easy for people to get those to you. You know, if they're big documents that can't be emailed, that's just one more hurdle that that your team members have to jump over to get you what you need. So if you can create a Dropbox account that they can sort of upload something with the click of a button, or have it, you know, some project management platforms allow people to just upload things with relative ease. So just thinking through, you know, how can I make this easier for my team members to get this information to me? It's a good question, though. I myself just wrapped up a FEMA grant, which required a huge amount of documentation and collection of years old records, and that was certainly difficult to predict how long that would take. So that was a key point in my after action review, noting that we need to be a little bit more conservative in terms of projecting and predicting how long that activity can take, because it's so dependent on what records are available and how much time your project partners have to participate.
Okay, well, thank you, Brooke. Doesn't look like any more questions are coming in.
My pleasure. And you have my email here, so in the future, if you run into roadblocks on projects, which I'm sure you will, do please feel free to reach out, and I would love to troubleshoot them together. I love putting project plans together, and I have fun doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for having us today, and looking forward to the next time.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.